I was initially assigned by the Washington Post just a few days after the international public health emergency was declared in August 2014. And it was very nerve-wracking. I think Ben Solomon from the New York Times had arrived a few days before. John Moore from Getty Images had arrived maybe a few days before, but that was really it in terms of international journalists. And so I called Ben, who I know is a friend of mine, and I said, what's the situation? Is this advisable? I did, like a lot of people, I didn't really know the ins and outs of Ebola. It was something that was elusive thing that would occasionally rear up in DR Congo, but they were much smaller outbreaks in very remote areas. So I had to do a lot of research. I read a lot. I took a couple of days. I said, okay, let me think about this. And I talked to Ben and I read up. Ultimately, I found a quote by this man named Peter Payot, who was one of the original identifiers of the virus. And he said, I would ride on a subway next to someone with Ebola. As long as they don't vomit on you or something, you ought to be okay. And I thought of a person who has that level of expertise, if that's his advice, then I think with the right levels of precaution, this is something that's approachable. So I went. I went with a knot in my stomach, but I went. You go to these burials and the community is so upset and everything is so awry. Men are coming in and putting on this personal protective equipment that's very frightening looking. Actually, if I had to sort of gravitate towards one thing that I felt was like a summation of the experience, I actually think it's a photograph of what they started calling safe and dignified burials. And the body has been laid out. And in fact, this particular death was perhaps not an Ebola case. The family was very convinced that this was not an Ebola case. But the government mandated that everyone that was dying had to be treated as a potential case until they could rule out otherwise. So initially they weren't allowing for any type of bereavement process at all. Like people couldn't pray, they couldn't engage, they couldn't do any of the traditional procedures that signified, burial, washing bodies, all this stuff was prohibited. So people were deprived of all of these very important components of saying goodbye. So they started to implement at least a few moments for people to pray and have a few parting words, despite the fact that they couldn't touch the bodies. And there's one photograph of a line of people from a Muslim family, a Muslim community, in the midst of a moment of prayer. And on the far side are three men in the suits. But those men, I think, are situated within the frame in a way that puts them in what I think is the right context. Like we saw so many pictures of those guys, and so many of the pictures were sort of all about them. And sometimes we didn't necessarily see them really in the community and how bizarre they looked in the community. So that one picture where you really saw at least the community trying to have a normative experience around death in this totally abnormal set of circumstances, with those guys placed, I think, in their proper context. I really enjoy working in Africa because I'm fundamentally really interested in issues of post-colonial states. What is the evolutionary process that's happening now about 50, 60 years out from independence? How are things being organized? How are notions of national identity being forged? There's still, I think, tremendous amounts of issues around national identity questions. Various groups being ensnared in boundaries that were drawn arbitrarily by colonial powers, or at least based on their interests rather than the interests of the communities that existed. So those are things that enduringly keep me interested in various dynamics around the continent, because I see those as being very interconnected with the conflicts of today. And Sierra Leone, Liberia, the affected countries are certainly places where the institutions are relatively weak. They were completely devastated by the lengthy civil wars that happened both in Liberia and Sierra Leone. So it's certainly an environment where the levels of development are just nowhere near what they needed to be to adequately deal with a crisis like the Ebola virus. So there's a lot of sort of institutional elements to at least the response aspect of Ebola that I see as being very much related to, the sort of broader post-colonial landscape.